Welcome to SLUMBERVERSE! Oh gee, another dimension of naps!
Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. The night Lyra arrived, every clock in Millhaven chose its own moment to pause, as if time itself had decided this birth deserved to be witnessed from multiple angles. The grandfather clock in the town square stopped at 11:47, while Mrs. Chen's kitchen timepiece settled on 12:03, and old Henrik's brass pocket watch found peace at 11:52. In that gentle chaos of suspended minutes, Lyra slipped into the world with the softest sigh, her eyes opening not to focus on faces, but to gaze past them, as though greeting visitors only she could see. Her grandmother Iris, holding the baby by the window 3 days later, was the first to notice the lights. They drifted around Lyra's temples like pearls made of moonbeam, moving with the lazy contentment of butterflies in a summer garden. Iris had lived long enough to know that some mysteries deserved acceptance rather than explanation, so she simply watched and began to understand their rhythm. The lights appeared during moments of deep feeling, when Lyra nursed, when she dreamed, when afternoon sun painted golden squares across the nursery floor. As Lyra grew from bundle to toddler, Iris discovered the lights weren't unique to her granddaughter. Walking through town with the child balanced on her hip, she began noticing similar glimmers around other people. They clustered thick as morning fog around Mr. Peterson at the hardware store, barely whispered at the edges of young Sarah's vision, but around Lyra they seemed different, more respectful, as if recognizing something that commanded gentler approach. The first time Lyra spoke of them, she was 3, stirring oatmeal that had grown cold while she pointed toward the window. "The pretty lights are hungry again, Grandmama," she said with matter-of-fact certainty. Iris set down her coffee cup, heart skipping once before settling into steadier rhythm. "What do they look like when they're hungry?" she asked as calmly as she could manage. Lyra considered this with the serious concentration small children bring to important questions. "Like soap bubbles made of wishes," she said finally. "They're looking for something warm to eat, but not food warm, heart warm." She stirred thoughtfully. "Sometimes they find it, and sometimes they have to make their own." That afternoon, Iris began keeping a journal, not of daily events, but of moments that felt completely, authentically real. The way Lyra's laugh sounded, discovering a ladybug in the garden. The exact shade of green the maple leaves turned after first frost. The weight of her granddaughter's hand in hers walking to the post office. She wrote these things with careful attention, creating a catalogue of genuine experiences. Though she couldn't yet articulate why such documentation felt necessary, the lights, she noticed, grew dimmer around these recorded moments, as if they had less need to linger where truth had been carefully preserved. But they brightened around the stories people told themselves. Mrs. Henderson's claims about her late husband's romance, young Tom's insistence about his high school football stardom. Lyra watched these discrepancies without judgment, absorbing some deeper understanding with the patient curiosity of someone learning a new language. By age 4, Lyra had developed what Iris privately called the weight test. She could distinguish the solid, grounding heft of true memory from the shimmering perfection of one woven by the pearl-like lights. It was like feeling the difference between a real rose with its subtle thorns and dew-kissed petals, and one crafted from silk, exquisite in imitation but lacking living scent. She didn't always know why she knew. She simply felt it, a soft hum beneath her skin. The lights weren't malicious, Lyra understood instinctively. They were wistful wanderers seeking comfort, drawn to the radiant embers of human experience. In their gentle hunger, they would weave threads of light into memory's tapestry, creating scenes beautiful and convincing, yet rootless in actual occurrence. They were simply seeking to belong, to feel echoes of warmth they couldn't generate themselves. One evening, as rain stitched soft patterns on the roof, Lyra climbed onto Iris's lap by the window. "Grandmama," she said carefully, because the word held the whole house in it, "how do I know which things are true?" Iris's hand smoothed her hair, slow as evening. "We'll learn the shapes together," she said. "Truth has a weight that doesn't hurt your arms. And sometimes, little bird, what isn't true can still be kind. We'll sort them gently." As Lyra drifted towards sleep, pale lights hovered at the room's edge, patient as moonlight. She had the feeling that everyone, seen and unseen, was waiting for the same small merciful lesson to begin. The clocks throughout town continued their independent rhythms, each holding its own version of the moment, and in that gentle discord, something beautiful was learning to breathe. Morning arrived soft and unhurried, the way it does in houses where time has learned to move like honey. Iris opened the curtains with the reverence of someone unveiling a daily gift, letting pale light spill across worn wood and the blue ceramic bowl where tomorrow's bread was already dreaming. The pearl-like lights lingered at the window's edge, patient as morning mist, and Lyra padded into the kitchen with sleep-warmed cheeks, climbing onto her chair to watch them with the careful attention of someone learning a new language. The journal became their evening sacrament. Each twilight, grandmother and granddaughter would sit at the kitchen table as purple shadows painted the windows, a single candle flickering between them, not for romance, but for the kind of focus that honors small truths. Iris had begun calling their home a place for keeping, though she never said exactly what it kept. The rooms themselves seemed to understand their purpose. Windows with wavy glass remembered laughter differently than the hallway, which held the echo of footsteps, while the breadboard carried the whispered songs of knives and the cupboard breathed with decades of gathered spice. "Tell me something that felt heavy today," Iris would say, pen poised over the leather-bound book that had become their repository of authentic moments. Lyra would close her eyes, feeling for that quality Iris had taught her to recognize, the weight of genuine experience, solid as river stones in still water. "Mrs. Patterson gave me an extra cookie," she might begin, then pause, that distant look crossing her face. But the lights got thick around her when she said I reminded her of her daughter. I think she never had a daughter. Iris developed her own gentle shorthand, real cookie, real kindness, story about daughter, borrowed light. She understood now that the creatures weren't malicious but profoundly homesick, weaving beautiful lies not from cruelty, but from desperate longing to feel the warmth of belonging somewhere, to someone. They were like pressed flowers, she explained to Lyra, beautiful in their preservation of what once was, but no longer alive with morning dew and the promise of new petals. The house itself began responding to their practice. Colors grew more vivid, rooms felt more solid, as if their careful attention to authentic experience was feeding something essential in the very walls. The lights still drifted through windows each evening, but they moved differently now, less urgently, more like visitors who knew they were welcome but understood the boundaries of hospitality. One afternoon, while Iris dozed in her chair, Lyra made a discovery that changed the very air around them. Sitting on the porch steps, watching the lights drift between maple branches, she began to hum, not a melody she recognized, but a sound that rose from somewhere deeper than memory. It wasn't quite music, more like the voice contentment might have if it could sing. The lights paused in their wandering, turning toward her with what felt unmistakably like recognition. The humming continued, flowing from her throat like water, finding its natural course. The lights drifted closer, their pearl luminescence pulsing gently in rhythm with her breath. For the first time, Lyra felt she was truly speaking with them, communicating in their native language of longing and tenderness. When Iris woke to find her granddaughter surrounded by dozens of the creatures, all hovering in peaceful suspension, she held very still, understanding she was witnessing something sacred. That evening, their journal ritual deepened. "They're not just hungry for memories," Lyra explained, small hands wrapped around warm milk. "They're homesick. They come from somewhere time moves like honey, and everything here feels too fast, too sharp. They make soft memories because they need soft places to rest." Iris wrote this revelation carefully, understanding that her granddaughter had crossed some threshold into deeper wisdom. They were becoming something the town had never had. Not defenders or exorcists, but translators, learning to help two kinds of homesickness find comfort without consuming each other. As Lyra grew drowsy against her grandmother's shoulder, the lights continued their gentle dance outside, no longer haunting but blessing. The house sighed into evening with the satisfaction of truth acknowledged, while throughout Millhaven, the independent clocks kept their own versions of this moment, when understanding began to bloom like night-flowering jasmine, sweet and patient in the gathering dark. The morning Lyra started school, she carried 3 smooth river stones in her pocket, gifts from Iris that clinked softly with each step, a gentle percussion that seemed to calm the pearl-like lights drifting around other children like excited fireflies drawn to new possibilities. The school building breathed with the particular energy of September beginnings, all pencil shavings and floor wax and the bright anticipation that makes hallways hum with whispered secrets. Mrs. Chen, whose kitchen clock had once chosen its own moment to pause, now stood at the classroom door, greeting each child with a smile that felt practiced but honest, the way morning birds repeat their songs not from habit, but from joy. She noticed immediately how Lyra moved through the space, not with the bouncing energy of her classmates, but with that same attentive calm she brought to evening journals, as if she were reading the room like a beloved story. The lights were everywhere here. Lyra discovered, clustering thick around certain children like soft halos made of longing. They gathered around Tommy when he told elaborate tales of summer adventures that shimmered with impossible perfection, and around quiet Emma, whose birthday party stories glowed with the particular brightness that made other children ache with envy. Lyra felt the familiar tilt in her chest, the way truth and borrowed light weighed differently against her ribs. At lunch, she chose her seat with the same gentle intention Iris brought to arranging flowers, not forced, but allowing natural harmony to emerge. Her sandwich, cut diagonally the way love always cuts things, sat between her and Emma like a small offering. "I like birthday parties," Lyra said simply, unwrapping her food with quiet deliberation. "What's your favorite part about them?" Emma's eyes grew distant, touching her temple where the lights pulsed with desperate creativity. "The cake," she began, then paused, something in Lyra's patient attention creating space for truth to breathe. "Actually," she said slowly, reaching into her own lunch bag, "it was just me and my mom last time. But we made cupcakes, and she let me lick the bowl." The memory that settled into place had weight, warmth, the particular sweetness of authentic experience shared without shame. Mrs. Chen began to notice how conversations grew more honest when Lyra joined them, though she couldn't name what was different. During storytime, when children shared weekend adventures, she watched this quiet girl listen with that distant, weighing expression, occasionally reaching into her pocket to touch something that seemed to anchor her. Whatever Lyra carried there appeared to create pockets of unusual calm, like cool water poured over fevered skin. One afternoon during art class, a boy named Daniel burst into tears over a broken toy robot, the lights around him flaring with indignation as they painted vivid pictures of heroic mechanical companions and distant, adoring uncles. Lyra knew the robot was simple plastic, probably broken by Daniel himself, but she also saw the genuine pain in his eyes, the feeling of loss that was completely real, regardless of the memory's embellishments. She pulled one of Iris's stones from her pocket and placed it gently in Daniel's palm. "This stone feels like it's been waiting a long time for someone to hold it," she said softly. "It knows about broken things and it knows about mending." The cool weight seemed to anchor something in Daniel's chest, and the brilliant fabricated memory began to recede, replaced by the simple, solid comfort of being witnessed in his actual sadness. Mrs. Chen found herself staying after school to observe this quiet transformation, understanding she was witnessing something remarkable. Lyra wasn't eliminating the mysterious lights that hovered around certain children, but somehow teaching them to feed on authentic sweetness instead of desperate hunger. The classroom itself began to feel different, more solid, more peaceful, as if truth had its own gravitational pull that helped everything else find its proper place. Walking home through afternoon light that painted everything gold, Lyra felt the remaining stones in her pocket and understood that school was another kind of keeping place, where small truths could be tended like seedlings in careful hands. The lights drifted alongside her, no longer frantic but content, having discovered that reality, however ordinary, carried flavors more nourishing than any beautiful lie. Behind her, the school settled into evening quiet, windows reflecting the last amber rays, while Mrs. Chen locked the classroom door with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed small miracles disguised as ordinary Tuesday afternoons. Ahead, Iris waited with warm milk and gentle questions about the day's discoveries, ready to add new entries to their journal of authentic moments, each one a seed planted in the soft earth of understanding, growing toward something beautiful and true. The library discovered Lyra the same way rivers find their way to the sea, naturally, inevitably, through the gentle pull of something that had been waiting. 3 weeks into the school year, when autumn painted the maple leaves in whispers of amber and gold, her feet began carrying her past the playground during recess, drawn to the brick building that sat between the bakery and the tailor, like a quiet secret kept in plain sight. The heavy oak doors opened with a sigh that felt like entering a cathedral built of paper and dreams, where dust motes drifted through afternoon light, like tiny prayers finding their way home. Inside, the air held the particular stillness that comes when thousands of stories rest together in peaceful coexistence, each one complete and honest about being exactly what it was, imagination made visible, wonder given form. Marcus stood behind the circulation desk, barely 22 and new to Millhaven, arranging returned books with the careful attention someone brings to handling sleeping birds. His movements carried the deliberate gentleness of someone who understood that books held more than words. They carried the breath of everyone who had ever opened them, the fingerprints of 1,000 different kinds of longing. When he looked up and saw Lyra watching from behind a tall stack of picture books, his eyes held the deep brown warmth of tea steeped in patience. "The lights don't come here," Lyra said without preamble, because she had learned that some truths deserved immediate recognition. The pearl-like creatures that followed most people like gentle shadows were notably absent, as if the library existed in some protected space where borrowed memories couldn't take root. Marcus paused in his shelving, a copy of Where the Wild Things Are suspended in his hands, and looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time. "I've noticed that too," he admitted, his voice carrying the soft precision of someone who chose words like river stones, smooth, solid, carefully selected. "Books are different. They're honest about being stories. They don't pretend to be memories." Lyra pulled one of Iris's stones from her pocket, rolling it between her palms as she considered this revelation. "They already know their shape," she said slowly, understanding blooming like morning light across still water. "The lights look for soft places where they can weave new patterns, but stories have already found their form." "Exactly," Marcus said, crouching to meet her eyes at the same level. "There's no confusion here about what's real and what's imagined. Every book says, here's a story out, and everyone knows what they're getting. The lights respect that kind of honesty." That afternoon began a ritual that would shape both their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. As the library prepared to close, Marcus made tea in the small staff kitchen, chamomile that smelled like evening meadows and childhood lullabies, and they sat at the reading table near the poetry section, where late sunlight painted golden squares across worn wood that remembered decades of gentle use. Between them, they established a practice as simple and sacred as evening prayer. Each would share one completely authentic memory from their day, no matter how ordinary or small. Marcus spoke first, his hands wrapped around the warm mug like an anchor in calm seas. "This morning I watched a spider rebuild her web in the corner by the biography section. She moved without frustration, just patient certainty like she knew the pattern by heart." Lyra felt the weight of truth in his words, solid and grounding as river stones. "Tommy's lights got so thick today he forgot his real lunch," she offered in return. "But when I shared my apple with him, they settled down. And he remembered he actually prefers peanut butter to the fancy sandwiches they were showing him." The library seemed to exhale around them, settling into evening with the satisfaction of a space being used for its deepest purpose. Through the tall windows, they could see the pearl-like lights drifting past on the sidewalk, following people home like gentle escorts, but none crossed the threshold into their sanctuary of honest stories. As weeks passed, their evening ritual deepened into something sacred. Marcus would brew different teas, mint for clarity, ginger for courage, lavender for the kind of peace that comes when truth is spoken without fear of judgment. The library itself seemed to approve, books settling more securely on their shelves, the very air growing thick with contentment. Outside, Millhaven continued its gentle dance between reality and borrowed light, the independent clocks marking their own versions of time's passage. But inside the library, two souls were learning the ancient art of witnessing each other's authentic experience, creating a space where memory could rest without embellishment, where stories could be stories, and where the lights learned to respect the difference between imagination and deception, a lesson that would ripple outward like circles on still water, touching lives in ways both seen and unseen. The kitchen timer began its stuttering protest on a Tuesday morning when autumn had painted the world in watercolor whispers, its mechanical hiccup drawing Iris's attention the way a bird's broken song might catch the ear of someone who understood the language of small distresses. Perhaps Henrik could coax it back to proper rhythm, she suggested with the casual grace of someone planting seeds in fertile soil, wrapping the small silver timepiece in soft cloth like a precious secret. Lyra's feet found their way to the clockmaker's shop with the same natural certainty that had led her to the library, drawn by something deeper than curiosity, a recognition that hummed just beneath her conscious understanding. The shop announced itself through layers of sensation, the golden warmth of brass-catching afternoon light, the sweet metallic scent of oil and careful maintenance, and beneath it all, the patient symphony of dozens of timepieces keeping their own versions of the present moment. Henrik emerged from behind the counter like a figure stepping out of a fairy tale written in gears and springs, his weathered hands moving with the deliberate grace of someone who had spent decades teaching time to behave. The pearl-like lights that followed most people through their daily routines drifted around him differently, not absent, but organized, moving in slow, contemplative circles as if they had found their own rhythm in his presence. "You're the child who speaks with the homesick ones," Henrik said without preamble, his accent carrying the soft edges of somewhere far away and long ago. His words weren't a question but a recognition, the way morning recognizes dawn or rivers know their way to the sea. The lights around Lyra pulsed gently, responding to some quality in his voice that felt like understanding made audible. Inside, the shop breathed with mechanical contentment, pendulums swaying in their eternal dance between here and there, while brass gears caught light, like small suns scattered across workbenches worn smooth by decades of gentle use. The pearl-like creatures drifted between the timepieces like curious cats, drawn to the steady heartbeat of measured moments, but moving with unusual peace, as if they had found sanctuary in this temple of patient precision. Henrik settled into his workbench chair with careful grace, the kitchen timer cradled in his palms like a small bird that had forgotten how to sing. "They're not parasites," he said softly, using a tiny brush to clean dust from gears no bigger than dewdrops. "They're travelers from a dimension where time moves like honey, where moments stretch and fold back on themselves in gentle loops. Here everything rushes past too quickly, too sharp-edged. They create soft memories because they need soft places to rest." Lyra perched on a worn stool beside him, watching his fingers work with the delicate precision of someone who understood that healing required both skill and tenderness. "They're homesick," she said, the words settling into place with the weight of revelation. "Exactly so." Henrik nodded, his eyes crinkling with the satisfaction of someone whose deepest understanding had been recognized. Think of a child far from home, trying to recreate the comfort of familiar bedtime stories. Sometimes the details become more beautiful than they were, but the longing underneath is completely real. He taught her the deeper humming that afternoon, not just the instinctive sound she had discovered on her porch, but the full frequency of contentment, the voice a heart makes when it is found exactly where it belongs. His demonstration resonated through the floorboards, a sound like the earth itself sighing with satisfaction, and the lights responded immediately, their pearl luminescence pulsing in gentle rhythm with the vibration. "It's not about controlling them," Henrik explained as Lyra practiced, her young voice finding the tone with surprising ease. "It's about offering them what they truly seek, the feeling of home, the texture of time that moves with love instead of urgency. When people understand this difference, the lights can feed on genuine warmth instead of desperate hunger." As evening painted the shop windows purple, Henrik shared a memory that carried the weight of authentic experience. His wife Anna, who had passed 3 winters ago, and how the lights had offered him perfect moments that never happened, conversations by firelight, dances in kitchens that existed only in longing. "I thanked them for their kindness," he said, winding a small mantel clock whose silver chimes sounded like crystallized laughter. "But I chose to keep the real warmth, her actual laugh, her true touch, even though they came wrapped in grief." The lights understood, and they learned to hover near the authentic sweetness instead of trying to replace it. Walking home through streets where independent clocks marked their own versions of twilight, Lyra carried Henrik's lesson like a smooth stone in her chest. The lights followed with new respect, no longer frantic but content, having discovered that understanding was more nourishing than any beautiful lie. Behind her, the clockmaker's shop settled into evening quiet, brass faces gleaming in the lamplight, keeping patient time, while the pearl-like creatures learned to dance in rhythm with authentic moments, each one precious as morning dew catching the first light of dawn. Summer unfolded over Millhaven like a gentle breath, bringing with it the festival of gentle lights that transformed the town square into a constellation of paper lanterns and whispered hopes. The celebration arrived without fanfare, the way all meaningful things do, quietly, naturally, as if the streets themselves had decided it was time to glow. Lyra walked beside Iris through the gathering twilight, watching families emerge from their homes carrying blankets and thermoses, children clutching balloons that bobbed like earthbound stars. The pearl-like lights were everywhere tonight, drawn to the collective warmth like moths to candlelight. They danced between the lanterns with unusual excitement, their luminescence pulsing in rhythm with laughter and the soft strumming of guitars that made the evening air itself seem to sing. Lyra noticed how they clustered more thickly around certain people, weaving elaborate tapestries of perfect moments that shimmered with desperate beauty. Near the old bandstand, she spotted Mrs. Hartwell sitting alone on a weathered bench, her silver hair catching lantern light like spun moonbeams. The memory parasites surrounded her in a gentle cloud, painting vivid scenes that made Lyra's chest tighten with recognition. Sunday dinners with grandchildren who brought flowers, birthday parties where small voices called her name, holiday mornings filled with the patter of little feet across her kitchen floor. Lyra approached with the careful grace Henrik had taught her, settling beside the elderly woman without invitation, but with the natural ease of someone offering shelter from rain. "The lights are beautiful tonight," she said simply, letting the deeper hum rise in her throat, not to banish the pearl-like creatures, but to offer them the frequency of contentment, the sound a heart makes when it has found exactly where it belongs. Mrs. Hartwell's eyes held the particular brightness of someone living inside a cherished dream, but something in Lyra's presence created space for deeper truth to breathe. "They come every Sunday," she said softly, her fingers worrying the edge of her shawl. "My David brings his little ones by. We make pancakes together, and Emma always wants extra syrup." The lights pulsed more gently around them both, responding to the mixture of longing and honesty in her voice. "Pancakes are wonderful for sharing stories," Lyra said carefully, feeling the familiar weight of borrowed memory against authentic love. "Would you like to plant some herbs that children might enjoy when they do visit? Mint for tea, maybe some strawberries that taste like summer mornings." Something shifted in Mrs. Hartwell's expression, like morning light touching still water. The elaborate fantasy of weekly visits began to soften, not disappearing but transforming into something more honest, genuine hope that someday, perhaps connection might bloom naturally from seeds of authentic kindness. "I've been thinking about my garden," she said slowly. "It's been so empty since Harold passed." The following afternoon, Lyra returned with small pots of herbs and the patient enthusiasm of someone who understood that real moments required tending. They worked together in Mrs. Hartwell's backyard, hands deep in earth that smelled of possibility and rain, creating something tangible that could grow into authentic joy. The pearl-like lights hovered nearby, no longer weaving elaborate fantasies, but feeding on the genuine warmth of two people sharing purposeful work as mint found its place beside the kitchen. Window and strawberry plants settled into carefully prepared soil. Mrs. Hartwell began sharing real memories, Harold's terrible jokes, the way morning coffee tasted better when shared, the satisfaction of watching things grow under patient care. Each authentic moment settled into place with solid weight, and the lights responded by growing calmer, more content, as if they had discovered that truth carried its own luminescence. "They might not come every Sunday," Mrs. Hartwell said as they watered the new plantings, her voice carrying the gentle strength of someone choosing hope over fantasy. "But when they do, we'll have fresh mint for tea, and stories about how these strawberries learned to love the sun." Walking home through streets still decorated with festival remnants, Lyra understood that her role was expanding beyond simple recognition. She was becoming a gardener of authentic moments, helping people plant seeds that could grow into genuine connection, rather than relying on the beautiful but rootless flowers the lights provided. The pearl-like creatures followed with new respect, having learned that reality, however ordinary, offered nourishment more sustaining than any perfect illusion. Behind her, Mrs. Hartwell stood at her kitchen window, watching the planted garden with the satisfaction of someone who had chosen hope over fantasy, while above them all, the independent clocks of Millhaven continued marking their own versions of time's passage, each one holding space for small miracles disguised as ordinary afternoons when seeds were planted and truth took root in fertile soil. The seeds planted in Mrs. Hartwell's garden began sprouting, in ways that had nothing to do with soil or sunshine, their invisible roots spreading through Millhaven like morning light, finding its way into shadowed corners. Lyra discovered that understanding the pearl-like lights was only the first step in a deeper dance, one that required not walls or barriers, but something more like the silk curtains Iris hung in summer windows, allowing gentle breezes to whisper through while keeping autumn leaves from scattering across the kitchen floor. She practiced this new art in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, learning to create what she began thinking of as soft boundaries, not rejection but redirection, not banishment but invitation to find nourishment elsewhere. The technique required the same patient attention Iris brought to her evening journals, a quality of focused tenderness that seemed to make space around authentic experience, while offering the homesick creatures alternative sources of comfort. At home, they developed rituals that felt like prayers made of intention and breath. Iris would place 4 smooth stones at the corners of their kitchen table, lighting a single candle, whose flame leaned toward their conversations as if listening. "We'll hold what's true in this circle," she would murmur, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that protection could be gentle. Lyra would find the deeper hum Henrik had taught her, letting it rise from her chest like contentment made audible, and the pearl-like lights would gather at the table's edge like patient birds on a garden fence. The real test came during lunch periods at school, where Sarah sat with her name written hopefully under piano on the winter recital sign-up sheet. The lights around her pulsed with desperate creativity, weaving elaborate memories of standing ovations and velvet dresses, fingers dancing across keys with impossible grace. But Lyra had noticed something else, how Sarah's hands moved when she thought no one was watching, tapping rhythms against her desk that seemed to calm the crying babies from the daycare next door. "Your fingers know a different kind of music," Lyra said one afternoon as they shared her sandwich, placing one of Iris's stones between them like a small moon. The lights around Sarah flickered with defensive brightness, clinging to their beautiful fabrication, but something in Lyra's voice created space for deeper truth to breathe. Sarah's eyes grew distant, touching the stone with careful reverence. "I've never actually played piano," she admitted quietly, the words carrying the weight of someone releasing a burden they hadn't realized they were carrying. "But sometimes when babies cry, I hum and they get quiet. It's like my voice knows how to rock them to sleep." Together, they practiced the art of gentle redirection. Lyra taught Sarah to breathe in rhythm with authentic memory, to feel the difference between borrowed perfection and genuine gift. When Sarah hummed, really hummed, not the elaborate melodies the light suggested, something shifted in the air around them. The pearl-like creatures began feeding on the warmth of her natural talent, than the desperate hunger for recognition that had driven their elaborate fantasy. The change rippled outward like circles on still water. During recess, crying children gravitated toward Sarah's voice like flowers turning toward sunlight. Teachers noticed how playground disputes settled more quickly when she was nearby, though they couldn't name what was different. The lights around her grew calmer, their luminescence softening into something that felt less urgent, more content. Marcus observed these transformations during their evening tea rituals at the library, watching how Lyra carried herself with new confidence that seemed to create pockets of unusual calm wherever she went. "You're learning something important," he said one afternoon, steam rising from chamomile that smelled like peaceful dreams. "The lights around you move differently now, less frantic, more grateful. I'm learning to offer them what they really want," Lyra explained, her small hands wrapped around the warm mug like an anchor in gentle seas. "They don't actually want to create lies. They want to belong, to feel useful. When people discover their real gifts, the lights can help nurture those instead of weaving fantasies." Walking home through streets painted purple by twilight, Lyra felt the soft boundaries she was learning to create, extending around her like invisible silk, not to exclude but to guide. The technique was becoming as natural as breathing, a way of helping both humans and lights find their way to genuine nourishment, teaching the homesick creatures that truth carried its own luminescence, more sustaining than any perfect illusion. Above them all, the independent clocks of Millhaven continued their patient marking of time's passage, while the pearl-like lights learned a new choreography, dancing in rhythm with authentic moments rather than desperate hunger. Discovering that reality, however ordinary, offered warmth more lasting than any beautiful lie. Night fell gently over Millhaven after the festival, and the library, once filled with the rustle of pages and curious voices, leaned into a hush so deep it seemed to listen for the world's quietest secrets. On these evenings, Lyra and Marcus stayed late, moving through the aisles with a kind of reverent choreography, straightening spines, tucking wayward slips of paper back between pages, switching off lamps one by one until the room glowed like a nest of embers. The pearl-like lights hovered beyond the tall windows, drawn but restrained, as if the glass itself remembered the unspoken rule. Inside, stories named themselves truthfully, and needed no gentle edits. Their rituals evolved with the night. Marcus brewed tea in the back room, chamomile or mint, letting the steam curl into the air like the breath of old stories. Instead of recounting the day, those memories already living in Iris's journal, they spoke only of the present, capturing what could be felt and seen, the warmth of a porcelain mug against the palm, the scent of mint lingering on Lyra's fingers, the way the desk turned honey gold under lamplight. Each detail spoken aloud settled with the weight of now, leaving no space for the memory creatures to slip their soft inventions between the syllables. Sometimes they experimented, sitting back to back on the reading rug, describing only the sounds, a page turning in the far stacks, the polite tap of a moth at a lampshade, the gentle protest of old pipes shifting into comfort. Other nights, they placed a bowl of water between them and watched their reflections tremble with each distant car or shifting step, learning from the water's honesty how it showed every disturbance and in time found its calm again. The memory lights, drawn but unable to feed, hovered at the threshold, soothed by the fullness of what was truly witnessed. Together they began a slim notebook, their ledger of the present. Each entry was a single sensory line, a cold mug ring on the desk, the soft squeak of a shoe, Marcus's sleeve brushing the spine of a blue atlas. Writing like this changed the air, layering the library's silence with new depth, a sense of shared purpose as honest and unadorned as the stories they told. With each midnight ritual, their connection deepened, a love that grew quietly like moss finding home on stone, fed not by grand declarations, but by the radical honesty of two souls who understood the difference between what is and what is wished for. There was comfort in the simple exchange of truth. Each moment added its own small strength to the tapestry of their bond. The library, too, seemed to approve, its shelves settling with contentment as if recognizing the sanctuary being made within its walls. Yet, as late summer ripened, Lyra noticed a subtle change. On certain nights, a restlessness moved through the cloud of memory lights outside, a tug almost too faint to name, a drifting along the line of street lamps, as if the creatures were counting them, pausing at each pool of light before moving on. It wasn't the frantic hunger she'd seen in the schoolyard, but something subtler, as though belonging itself was preparing to move. Marcus noticed too, watching from the window as the lights formed slow, patient streams, drifting eastward in thin, shimmering ribbons. They adapted their practice, acknowledging rather than resisting the movement. When the lights pressed more densely at the glass, Lyra would open a book and read a single honest sentence aloud, letting the sound bead on the air like dew. Marcus would follow with a present observation, the taste of cooled tea, the faint squeak of a cart, and together their words created a soft passage through which the lights could drift without attaching themselves to human hearts. Gad felt not like defense but gentle shepherding, a way of guiding homesick visitors toward their own season of change. One night, a wind rose from nowhere, brushing every page in the library with a sound like distant rain. Outside, the memory lights gathered into a long, pale ribbon and moved east, beautiful enough to ache. In their wake, the air felt clearer, as though the whole town had exhaled. "This is the shape of a season," Marcus murmured, not so much to Lyra as to the room itself. Lyra nodded, feeling the hum of understanding settle in her chest. She sensed that a new lesson was approaching, patient, inevitable, just as the first leaves tested hints of gold and every independent clock in Millhaven seemed for a moment to point quietly in the same direction. And as they stepped from the library into the early blue of morning, carrying the quiet strength of their midnight moments, Lyra felt the world tilting gently, preparing itself for whatever wonder would come next. The restlessness that had whispered through the library windows 3 nights before began revealing its true nature as September painted Millhaven in watercolors that seemed to bleed gently at their edges. Lyra woke to find the pearl-like lights moving differently outside her bedroom window, not their usual patient drift, but something purposeful and ancient, like rivers of starlight following currents only they could sense. The migration season had begun, though she wouldn't understand its full meaning until Henrik's weathered hands showed her how to read the signs. At breakfast, Iris paused with her coffee cup halfway to her lips, watching the luminous streams flow eastward through kitchen glass that caught morning light like captured prayers. "They're gathering," she observed, her voice carrying the gentle weight of someone who had witnessed seasons turn within seasons. The lights moved in ribbons of pearl and silver, their usual solitary wandering replaced by something that felt like purpose wrapped in silk, a collective pull toward something beyond the horizon. Walking to school, Lyra discovered the entire town caught in the tender grip of impossible remembering. Mrs. Patterson stood in her garden, tears of wonder streaming down her cheeks as she described a perfect snowfall that had never touched Millhaven, every flake distinct as crystal lace, the silence so complete it felt like the world holding its breath in reverence. At the corner store, Mr. Kim spoke of shooting stars that had written messages across the sky in languages no one recognized, though everyone understood their meaning perfectly. The children at school moved through their day wrapped in shared wonder, all claiming the same moment of inexplicable joy from the previous evening, standing in their separate backyards yet feeling connected to something vast and loving that had no name. Mrs. Chen found herself abandoning the planned lesson, instead listening as her students described the sensation of being held by invisible arms that smelled like cinnamon and distant starlight. During lunch, Lyra sought Henrik's wisdom, finding him in his shop surrounded by clocks that seemed to tick in gentle harmony, despite their independent rhythms. "Migration season," he explained, polishing a brass pendulum with careful reverence. "They gather like this every few years, when homesickness grows too heavy for individual wandering. The shared memories they're creating, they're not deceptions, child. They're farewell gifts, ways of leaving beauty behind before they journey home." Understanding bloomed in Lyra's chest like morning flowers opening to sunlight. The lights weren't trying to overwhelm or deceive. They were offering blessings, creating communal comfort before departure. But she also sensed the delicate balance required. Too much shared fantasy could blur the lines between what was real and what was wished for, leaving people adrift in beautiful lies. That afternoon, she and Marcus walked the forgotten edges of Millhaven, seeking empty spaces where the migrating lights could weave their farewell tapestries without attaching to human hearts. They found sanctuary in the abandoned mill behind the river, where broken windows sang with wind and shadows stretched long across floors that remembered the rhythm of grinding grain. Here Lyra hummed the deeper frequency Henrik had taught her, not to control but to invite, while Marcus spoke softly of present textures, crumbling mortar, dust motes dancing in sparse sunlight, the gentle protest of old wood settling into peaceful decay. The lights responded with grateful recognition, drifting away from the bustling town center to gather in these forgotten corners. In the old mill they wove intricate scenes of phantom industry, grain flowing like golden rivers, wheels turning with purpose, the satisfied hum of meaningful work. The fabricated memories were beautiful here, filling spaces that had no other purpose, allowing the creatures to feed on imagined warmth without burdening living hearts. As evening painted the sky in gentle purples, the town gathered spontaneously in the square, drawn by the same instinct that calls birds to migration routes written in their bones. People emerged carrying blankets and thermoses, understanding without words that they were witnessing something sacred. The memory lights formed spirals above them, weaving patterns that spoke of gratitude and farewell in languages older than human speech. Lyra stood at the center of it all, no longer the confused child who had first noticed the pearl-like visitors, but a young guardian who understood the art of compassionate guidance. As the lights began their final dance, spiraling higher until they formed a column of luminescence that seemed to bridge earth and stars, each person felt a gentle touch against their temple, not invasive but blessing, like being kissed goodbye by something that had come to love them during its stay. And then, like morning mist touched by sunlight, the lights began to fade, not disappearing but transforming, becoming part of the air itself. They left behind the perfect memories they had woven, not to deceive, but to remind the people of Millhaven that wonder existed, that love could take forms beyond imagination, and that sometimes the most beautiful truths came wrapped in the clothes of impossible dreams, carefully tended by those who understood the difference between authentic experience and gentle blessing. The quiet that followed the light's departure settled into Millhaven like morning mist, and within that gentle hush, Lyra began to notice the subtle changes in Iris, not dramatic shifts, but the way autumn arrives in a single leaf that turns gold while others remain green. Her grandmother moved with the same steady grace, but paused longer at windows, her fingers tracing patterns in condensation that seemed to spell words in languages only she could read. The pearl-like lights that had always drifted respectfully around their kitchen now gathered closer, their luminescence softer, more reverent, as if they sensed something sacred approaching. Their evening ritual continued with deeper tenderness. Iris lit the candle with hands that seemed more translucent each night, the flame leaning toward their conversations, as if listening for something specific. The journal lay open between them, its pages thick with authentic moments carefully preserved. But now Iris added new entries, observations about the weight of different kinds of truth, the texture of memories that served love rather than hunger. Sometimes, Iris said one twilight, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had learned to read the heart's deeper needs. The lights offer cushions for grief too sharp to hold without softening. Not deception, child, but mercy. She spoke of a letter from her long-departed sister, arriving just when loneliness felt too heavy, and how the borrowed warmth had helped her authentic love find its footing again. The heart has its own wisdom about what it needs to heal. Lyra carried these lessons to Henrik, finding him adjusting a clock whose chimes sounded like crystallized patience. "So your grandmother speaks truth," he said, polishing brass that caught afternoon light like captured prayers. "Sometimes the soul knows what it needs before the mind can accept it. The lights in their gentlest moments honor that knowing. They offer not replacement, but bridge, a way for love to cross the spaces where words cannot reach." As October painted the maple tree in honest golds and reds, Iris began sharing what she called her leaving gifts, small wisdoms wrapped in the cloth of daily ritual. She taught Lyra to fold each day closed, by noting 3 authentic textures, to breathe once for each genuine moment witnessed, to hold truth and kindness in equal reverence. "When the lights offer you comfort," she whispered, placing the kitchen timer between them so its gentle ticking could anchor their conversation in present moment, "you'll know whether to accept. Sometimes love wears the dress of impossible things." The morning Iris didn't wake. The house held its breath without breaking. She lay peaceful in her bed, a faint smile gracing her lips, surrounded by lights that pulsed not with hunger, but with pure, distilled affection. Lyra sat beside her, holding hands that felt like paper kissed by moonlight, and understood that some departures were not endings, but transformations, not absence but presence wearing different clothes. As she sat in that sacred quiet, a memory unfolded with vivid clarity. She and Iris in the garden that had never existed, sharing the conversation they had always meant to have. Words of profound love spoken without hurry, acknowledgments of every unspoken feeling, promises that stretched beyond the boundaries of time itself. It was the most perfect farewell imaginable, filled with everything the heart could wish for in such a moment. Lyra felt its weight against her chest and recognized the light's final gift, not deception, but blessing, woven from the love that had been so carefully tended in their home. She accepted it with gratitude, understanding that this borrowed perfection didn't diminish her authentic memories, but cushioned them, the way silk wraps precious stones. The real weight of Iris's hand, the actual scent of chamomile tea, the genuine wisdom shared over candlelit evenings, these remained untouched, while the impossible conversation settled beside them like a gentle embrace. Marcus arrived with bread and understanding silence. Henrik came with his pocket watch, listening to its steady rhythm as if consulting an old friend. The town flowed in with casseroles and awkward love, some carrying their own gift memories the lights had woven. Perfect words they wished they had spoken, comfort they needed to feel. Lyra blessed each offering, understanding now that love was large enough to hold both truth and the tender lies that helped truth become bearable. That evening, she opened the journal and wrote with Iris's pen, the page accepting her words like soil receiving seeds. She listed the real things: warm bread, Marcus's gentle presence, the weight of genuine grief. Then she drew a circle around the gift memory, honoring it as what it was: love made visible, comfort woven from longing, a bridge between what was and what the heart needed to remember. The lights hovered at the window, patient and respectful, having learned that the most beautiful service was sometimes the gentlest lie, carefully tended by those who understood the difference between authentic experience and sacred comfort, both necessary for hearts learning to hold the full weight of love in all its forms. The days that followed Iris's passing unfolded like petals releasing from a rose, each moment settling gently into the earth to nourish what would grow next. The house breathed differently now, not empty but expectant, like a theater between acts where the stage waits for new voices to fill its patient silence. Lyra moved through rooms that held the shape of her grandmother's presence. The journal opened beside the 4 stones that still marked their sacred circle, while the pearl-like lights drifted through windows with unusual reverence. Understanding they were witnessing the birth of something sacred, word traveled the way warmth moves through a room, slow, sure, reaching everyone who needed it. People began arriving with small boxes of keepsakes and large, careful silences, asking not for miracles but for gentleness. No sign hung on the door. The town simply decided, the way fields decide where footpaths ought to be, that this was where truth could rest and be treated kindly. Mrs. Chen came first, carrying her own borrowed memory wrapped in guilt and wonder. "I don't know if it's real," she whispered, settling into Iris's chair with careful reverence. "But it feels like love, and I need that to be enough." Lyra poured tea with deliberate grace, understanding her role was expanding beyond recognition into something deeper. Not judgment, but witness. Not correction, but compassionate discernment. She began teaching simple practices, rituals that anchored people in authentic experience. Before sharing a story, visitors would hold one of Iris's smooth stones, feeling its cool weight, breathing deeply, letting its solidity remind them of truth's grounding power. When memories felt too perfect, too shiny, she encouraged closing eyes and feeling for the quiet hum of their own heart, asking if the story resonated with that deeper knowing. Old Mr. Henderson arrived with tales his lights had woven about athletic prowess, his voice raspy with age and confusion. "I told young Timmy about my winning goal in the 48 championship, but then I remembered I was actually on the bench that game. It was beautiful, though." Lyra listened with patient attention. "The beauty of belonging was real, Mr. Henderson. The joy of being part of something bigger than yourself. Perhaps that's the memory worth holding." She discovered the art of creating sanctuary for gentle lies that served healing purposes. Together with Marcus, they found empty spaces: the abandoned mill, the old station waiting room, the derelict conservatory, where the lights could stage their soft pageants without rooting into living hearts. These became community gardens for kindness, places people could visit when they needed borrowed comfort, knowing exactly what they were receiving and choosing it with open eyes. Henrik recognized her transformation during one of his afternoon visits, bringing a silver locket watch with no hands. "For moments that should not be measured," he said, placing the chain over her head with blessing solemnity. "You've learned to speak both languages, child, the language of human heart and the language of homesick light. That makes you a keeper of the very possibility of peace." The pearl-like lights, which had returned after their migration, now moved around Lyra with deferential grace, as if recognizing her new authority. They still offered their gentle illusions, but her presence tempered their urgency, guiding them toward authentic warmth rather than desperate fabrication. She noticed how they paused near genuine acts of kindness, shared cookies, whispered comfort, feeding on real sweetness instead of weaving elaborate fantasies. Marcus watched her evolution with profound understanding that deepened their connection. Their midnight library rituals continued, but now included entries about the delicate art of guidance. "It's like tending a garden," she explained one evening, candlelight softening her face. "You don't pull up every weed because some have beautiful flowers. You learn which ones nourish the soil and which ones simply make it look pretty." The town's language began changing almost imperceptibly. People started asking, "Does it have good weight?" when listening to stories that shimmered too brightly. The phrase "present shelf" slipped into everyday speech, borrowed from a tiny table Marcus and Lyra placed by the library door, where anyone could leave one sentence about their now: the smell of rain on wool, the aftertaste of an orange, a shoe that squeaked on tile. As evening painted the windows purple, Lyra understood her calling was not burden, but gentle continuity, an inheritance of listening, sorting, and planting. Her legacy would not be eliminating false memories, for some were too tender and necessary for healing. Instead, she was cultivating wisdom, teaching that sometimes the heart's truth mattered more than the mind's accuracy, and that love, in all its forms, was always real. The independent clocks throughout Millhaven continued their patient discord, but within their varied rhythms, something beautiful was learning to keep time with both truth and tender mercy. Winter settled over Millhaven like a gentle exhale, painting the world in shades of pearl and silver that made the memory light seem like natural extensions of the season itself. The shorter days drew people closer to their hearths and closer to truth, as if the cold air made pretense too exhausting to maintain. In this hushed season, love found its way to Lyra and Marcus through the spaces between words, growing like moss on stone with patient certainty that needed no announcement. Their evening rituals at the library had evolved beyond careful cataloguing into something more intimate. Conversations that meandered like winter rivers, sharing fears that carried weight and hopes that held the scent of possibility. Marcus began arriving at Iris's house before their meetings, carrying soup in mason jars and the particular kind of silence that speaks louder than words. He would sit at the kitchen table, where the 4 stones still marked their sacred circle, not filling Iris's space but honoring it, while Lyra moved through familiar preparations with grace that seemed older than her years. The pearl-like lights gathered at the windows during these moments, their luminescence soft as candle flame, drawn to something they recognized but couldn't replicate. They watched Marcus reach across the table to steady Lyra's hands when grief rose like winter tide, witnessed the way she listened when he spoke of childhood libraries, where books had been friends when people felt too complicated. Between them, understanding grew in the smallest gestures: tea brewed without asking, stones placed in palms that needed anchoring, comfortable silences that required no embellishment. One evening, as snow began its patient work of making the world new, Marcus took her hand with simple honesty, carrying no expectation beyond the desire to offer comfort. The memory lights responded immediately, clustering thick around them with sudden excitement, weaving visions of perfect romance that shimmered with desperate beauty. Candlelit dinners that never happened materialized in the air between them. Declarations of love spoken in voices like warm honey, first kisses under stars that arranged themselves in impossible constellations. Lyra felt the familiar tilt in her chest, the way borrowed beauty weighed differently than authentic experience. The fabricated moments were exquisite, filled with every romantic detail 2 hearts could wish for, but they lacked the particular texture of truth, the slight tremor in Marcus's fingers, the real warmth of his palm, the way his eyes held questions instead of certainty. "They're offering us a beautiful story," she said softly, watching the lights weave scenes of impossible romance around their joined hands. The elaborate visions pulsed with seductive perfection, promising love without uncertainty, passion without vulnerability, connection without the messy work of truly seeing each other. Marcus understood immediately, his thumb tracing gentle circles against her skin, a touch that carried more weight than any fabricated passion. "I'd rather have the real story," he said, his voice carrying the quiet strength of someone who had learned to value truth over fantasy. "Even if it's uncertain, even if it's ordinary, especially then." The lights paused in their weaving as if considering this radical choice. Then slowly they began to settle, their urgent creativity softening into something more like blessing than seduction. Instead of elaborate romance, they offered simple enhancement, making the candlelight slightly warmer, the snow outside slightly more musical, the silence between words slightly more full of possibility. They had learned through witnessing this choice that love didn't need perfection to be nourishing. Their first kiss came weeks later, not a sudden spark but gentle convergence, like two currents meeting in a quiet stream. It tasted of chamomile and old paper, and the profound understanding that passes between souls who recognize their own reflection in another. The memory lights, present but respectful, found nothing to embellish, for the moment was perfect in its unadorned truth. Love grew in the spaces the lights learned to respect, real conversations that had texture and resolution, disagreements that led to deeper understanding, comfortable silences that needed no enhancement. Marcus would arrive with books he thought she'd enjoy, and Lyra would share observations about the town's changing relationship with its gentle visitors. They discovered that authentic connection carried its own luminescence, one the memory lights could admire but never improve upon. The pearl-like creatures, witnessing this daily choice of reality over fantasy, began feeding on the genuine warmth between them instead of trying to create it. They learned that truth, however ordinary, offered sustenance more lasting than any perfect illusion. Their presence around the couple grew calmer, more content, as if they had finally discovered the difference between creating beauty and recognizing it. As winter deepened, their love became part of their service to the community. People began asking for both of them, understanding instinctively that their bond demonstrated something important about choosing authenticity. They hosted small circles in the library's reading room, 5 chairs, 1 candle, a bowl of smooth stones, and the quiet promise that nothing would be added that didn't ask to be added. Marcus would begin with a sentence from their ledger of now. Lyra would hum the room into softness, and together they created sanctuary where human hearts could speak truths they had been brave enough to carry alone. Walking home through snow that caught streetlight like scattered prayers, they moved with the unhurried grace of people who had found their rhythm. The independent clocks throughout Millhaven kept their various times, but between them, love had learned its own patient measure, perfect in its imperfection, real as morning light touching frost on glass, witnessed by lights that had finally understood the profound beauty of choosing what is over what is wished for. Spring arrived like a whispered invitation, bringing with it the particular restlessness that calls teachers to their calling. The memory lights, now familiar as old friends, drifted through Millhaven with new purpose, drawn to hearts that carried questions too large for solitary answers. Lyra felt the shift like morning light touching frost, gentle, inevitable, full of quiet promise. People began arriving at the library not just seeking comfort, but asking to learn the art she and Marcus had been practicing in their midnight circles. Elena came first, a young teacher whose classroom had become a constellation of pearl-like lights, drawn to children's natural hunger for wonder. She carried herself with the careful attention of someone learning to navigate between what hearts needed to believe and what minds needed to know. "They're losing their way back to what's real," she explained, settling into the reading room where candles still marked sacred space. "The lights offer such beautiful stories that ordinary life feels grey by comparison." Lyra recognized the delicate balance Elena described, remembering her own childhood dance between the lights' offerings and Iris's gentle anchoring. Together, they developed what became known as the teaching season, a gentle curriculum that honored both imagination and authenticity. Children learned to hold smooth stones while sharing one genuine observation from their day, creating protective spaces around authentic experience where truth could rest without embellishment. Sarah arrived next, no longer the uncertain child who had once claimed phantom piano skills, but a young woman whose voice had found its true purpose in calming restless hearts. She brought with her a gift Lyra hadn't expected, the ability to teach the deeper hum to others, showing them how contentment could become audible, how peace could be offered like a bridge between what was and what was needed. The pearl-like lights responded to these teaching circles with unusual reverence, their behavior shifting from desperate creativity to gentle enhancement. Instead of weaving elaborate fantasies, they learned to illuminate authentic moments, making the memory of a child's laughter slightly more vivid, the texture of shared bread slightly more nourishing. They had discovered that truth, carefully witnessed, carried its own luminescence. Young Samuel joined their evening gatherings, a quiet boy whose eyes followed currents only he could see. Under Lyra's patient guidance, He learned to create what she called silk curtains, boundaries, gentle as evening breeze that allowed authentic experience to pass through while guiding the homesick lights toward the sanctuary, spaces where their beautiful illusions could bloom. Without burdening living hearts, the abandoned mill became his particular care, where phantom scenes of joyful industry brought peace to forgotten corners. Marcus documented their discoveries in careful script, creating what became the town's first manual of compassionate discernment. Not rules but invitations, ways to feel the weight of authentic experience, techniques for offering the lights genuine warmth instead of desperate hunger. The library's present shelf grew thick with contributions, sentences that anchored readers in the texture of now. As spring deepened into summer's gentle embrace, their teaching circles expanded beyond the library. Henrik, moving with the careful grace of advanced years, became the children's favorite storyteller, teaching them to distinguish between tales that asked to be believed and stories that asked to be enjoyed. His handless pocket watch, passed from child to child, helped them feel the difference between time that rushed toward fantasy and moments that settled into authentic presence. The transformation rippled through Millhaven like warmth through cold rooms. Parents requested guidance for their own relationships with the lights, understanding that children learned more from witnessed behavior than spoken lessons. The phrase "good weight" entered everyday conversation, and people began asking not whether memories were perfect, but whether they carried the solid comfort of truth. Eleanor, the baker, whose hands instinctively kneaded warmth into every loaf, discovered she could use the scent of fresh bread as an anchor for overwhelmed hearts. When customers arrived carrying memories too perfectly sweet, she would offer warm rolls, saying simply, "The real thing has weight that nourishes more deeply." The lights, drawn by authentic aroma and genuine kindness, learned to feed on present comfort rather than borrowed perfection. Walking through streets where independent clocks continued their patient discord, Lyra felt the satisfaction of seeds planted in fertile soil. The teaching season was becoming something larger, a way of helping entire communities learn to dance between imagination and authenticity. Guided by lights that had discovered their deepest service lay not in creating beautiful lies, but in blessing the courage required to find beauty in what was actually wonderfully true. As evening painted the windows purple and the first stars whispered their quiet names, the pearl-like light settled into contentment. Having learned that home was not a place but a feeling, the warmth that rose when truth and kindness met in careful balance, tended by hearts brave enough to choose what is over, what is wished for again and again, with infinite gentleness. The years began to layer themselves like rings in the heartwood of an ancient tree, each season leaving its quiet mark on both Lyra and the town that had learned to breathe in rhythm with her gentle wisdom. Time moved through Millhaven the way honey flows from a wooden spoon, unhurried, golden, carrying the accumulated sweetness of moments carefully tended. Lyra's hair had grown long enough to catch morning light like spun silver, and her hands had learned the particular grace that comes from years of holding both, authentic sorrow and borrowed comfort with equal reverence. The house that had once belonged to Iris now breathed with the rhythm of a life fully lived, its rooms filled with the soft conversations of people seeking guidance and the pearl-like lights that had become as natural as evening mist. The journal that had begun as simple record-keeping had grown thick with observations about the texture of genuine experience, pages worn soft by countless fingers, tracing words that anchored hearts in authentic moments. Visitors often asked to read certain passages, finding comfort in the careful documentation of ordinary miracles, the exact sound of rain on glass, the particular warmth of bread shared between friends, the way morning light painted kitchen walls in shades of possibility. Marcus moved through these spaces with the unhurried confidence of someone who had found his place in the world's deeper patterns. Their love had grown like oak trees, slowly, surely roots intertwining beneath the surface, while branches reached toward light with patient certainty. The library had become their shared sanctuary, where evening tea rituals continued to anchor the community in authentic moments, while their present shelf overflowed with sentences that captured the weight of genuine experience. The teaching season had evolved beyond seasonal gatherings into something woven into the very fabric of how Millhaven understood memory and truth. Elena's careful curriculum had spread through the school system, teaching children to feel the difference between stories that ask to be enjoyed and memories that claim to be real. The phrase, "Does it have good weight?" had become as natural as asking about the weather, a gentle shorthand for distinguishing between borrowed comfort and authentic experience. Henrik, moving now with the careful deliberation of someone whose years had taught him the value of each step, continued his Tuesday afternoon visits, bringing broken timepieces and stories about the nature of time itself. His pocket watch without hands had become a sacred teaching tool, passed from person to person during evening circles, helping them feel moments that deserve to exist outside the rushing current of measured minutes. One autumn afternoon, as golden light slanted through his shop windows, Henrik handed Lyra a small wooden box lined with velvet. Inside rested a miniature pendulum shaped like a droplet of amber. "For rooms where the breath needs help remembering its rhythm," he said, his voice carrying the soft authority of someone who had spent decades befriending time rather than trying to outwit it. They stood together while the shop told its gentle, unsynchronized chorus, and Henrik shared one final truth, that accuracy and reverence had always been uneasy neighbors in the world of clocks, and that he had, in the end, chosen reverence. The following week his door remained closed. He had slipped away with unshowy dignity, like a pendulum finding its natural stillness. The pearl-like lights gathered softly in his shop, weaving no elaborate scenes, only brightening the things that were already there, his hat on its hook, a tea-ring ghosted into the wood, the tiny amber pendulum catching a last square of sun. Marcus locked the door and placed the handless watch in the window, with a note in Lyra's careful script. For moments that should not be measured. The community had learned to hold both, the solid, grounding weight of authentic experience and the shimmering, tender beauty of what could have been, or what was simply needed to soften the edges of difficult truth. The abandoned mill had become a pilgrimage site, where the lights staged, their most elaborate pageants for visitors who needed borrowed comfort, but understood exactly what they were, receiving. Mrs. Hartwell's garden had grown into a community gathering place, where herbs planted in hope had become medicine for both body and spirit. As evening painted the windows purple and the first stars whispered their quiet names, Lyra understood that memory was not about perfect accuracy, but about the love we brought to our experiences. It was about the compassion we extended to ourselves and others in the face of life's inevitable sorrows and quiet joys. The pearl-like lights had taught her that longing was a powerful force, and that sometimes the heart's truth was more important than the mind's precise recall. Walking through streets where independent clocks continued their patient discord, she felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had learned to tend the balance between what hearts needed to believe and what minds needed to know. The lights no longer drifted as homesick wanderers, but moved with the contentment of creatures who had finally discovered that home was not a place but a feeling, the warmth that rose when truth and kindness met in careful balance, tended by hearts brave enough to choose what is over, what is wished for again and again, with infinite gentleness. The town had found its rhythm, not perfect, but honest about its imperfections, not without sorrow, but skilled in the art of holding grief with tenderness. And in that gentle discord of time kept by independent hearts, something beautiful continued to grow, nourished by the radical understanding that love, in all its honest, imperfect, utterly real forms, was always worth the careful tending it required. The evening light that painted Lyra's garden in shades of amber and rose carried the particular sweetness that comes when a life has found its proper rhythm, like a river finally reaching the sea, after meandering through landscapes both gentle and wild. She sat in the chair that had once been Iris's, her hands, lined now with the geography of decades spent holding both truth and tender mercy, resting on the journal that had grown thick as a small tree, its pages recording the accumulated wisdom of a town learning to breathe in harmony with its gentle visitors, the pearl-like. Lights drifted through the cooling air with the lazy contentment of old friends sharing comfortable silence, no longer homesick wanderers, but part of the great web of consciousness that connected all beings across dimensions. They pulsed with quiet gratitude, having discovered that home was not a place but a feeling, the warmth that rose when truth and kindness met in careful balance, tended by hearts brave enough to choose what is over, what is wished for again and again, with infinite patience. Marcus emerged from the kitchen, carrying chamomile tea that steamed like small prayers, his movements carrying the unhurried grace of someone who had learned that love was not destination, but daily practice. Their silver hair caught the last light, and their evening ritual continued with the constancy of tides, anchoring the present moment in the texture of shared warmth. The 4 stones still marked their sacred circle on the weathered table, worn smooth by countless fingers seeking anchor in authentic experience. Beyond their garden, Millhaven had found its own gentle rhythm over the years. The teaching season had become as natural as spring planting, with children learning to feel the weight of genuine experience, while adults practiced compassionate discernment. Sarah's voice could still be heard in the evenings, humming the deeper frequency that comforted restless hearts, while Elena's classroom remained a constellation where young minds learned to navigate between imagination and authenticity. The phrase "good weight" had woven itself into the town's natural vocabulary, a gentle shorthand for the radical practice of choosing reality over fantasy. The abandoned mill continued serving as sanctuary, where the lights staged their most elaborate pageants for visitors who needed borrowed comfort but understood exactly what they were receiving. The library's present shelf overflowed with sentences that anchored readers in the texture of now, while Henrik's handler's pocket watch, displayed in the town museum, reminded everyone that some moments were too precious to be measured by ordinary time. As twilight deepened into that blue hour when day and night exchanged their quiet secrets, Lyra reflected on the mystery that had shaped her calling. She had learned that her role was not to eliminate the pearl-like creatures, but to help them and humans coexist peacefully, teaching that memory was not about perfect accuracy, but about the love we brought to our experiences, the compassion we extended to ourselves and others in the face of life's inevitable mixture of sorrow and joy. Lyra understood now that she had become a translator between 2 kinds of homesickness, human longing for perfect connection and the light's desperate hunger for belonging. Her legacy was not the elimination of false memories, but the cultivation of wisdom, the knowing that sometimes the heart's truth mattered more than the mind's precision, and that love in all its honest, imperfect, utterly authentic forms was always real. The independent clocks throughout Millhaven continued their patient discord, each one holding its own version of the present moment, and in that gentle chaos, something beautiful had learned to keep time with both truth and tender mercy. The town had found harmony not through sameness, but through deep respect for the nuanced dance between what is and what hearts sometimes needed to believe. As the first stars began their quiet proclamation of eternity, the pearl-like lights began their evening dance, spiraling higher until they seemed to bridge earth and stars. They drifted like luminous seeds on evening air, no longer haunting but blessing, carrying forward the eternal lesson that consciousness, in all its forms, was simply love learning to recognize itself across the vast, tender distances that connected every heart to every other heart in the great web of being. And somewhere in that gentle luminescence, Lyra felt the presence of all who had come before: Iris's steady love, Henrik's patient wisdom, Marcus's unwavering honesty, woven into the fabric of her own understanding. She closed her eyes and let the deeper hum rise from her chest, not to guide or teach, but because the evening asked for a lullaby, and the sky had grown big with stars and infinite possibility. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.